How are we going to produce enough electricity? I also strongly believe there are many people with virtually no knowledge about where electricity actually comes from. It is not magic, and it doesn't come from the outlet in your wall. It starts somewhere.
And that's why we're here to educate today.
Yes, it is generated right now overwhelmingly by fossil fuel power plants. We are plugging in more and more gadgets every day. Electricity is the lifeblood of so many things that we do. We charge our phones, our power tools, from lawnmowers to cordless drills, electric heat, electric stoves, battery-powered everything. And what about as we increasingly plug in our cars? Are we going to do about the energy situation? If we're going to move to largely electric vehicles on the road, some folks targeting 2035. I've got two guys from We Energies with us this morning in studio. Brendan Conway, you see him on TV and hear him on the radio, usually when things are bad. We've had a big old storm and
good to be here today. Yeah.
Yes, right. So Brendan's with us this morning, and then he's brought Dan Krieger, who's Executive Vice President of Planning, who's a big projects guy. So how do we meet the demands for power today and in the future? Welcome to both of you. Really appreciate it. Dan,
Thank you.
Let me start with the premise that I laid out there. Am I right to be asking these questions, to be concerned with our electric generating capacity as both demand increases and then the pressure on you folks in the energy sector to move toward more renewable energy sources?
It's a big question. So happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
I yield the remainder of my time to Dan.
Okay.
You got plenty of it.
All right, terrific. Well, I'll start by saying that our plans are based on what we call affordable, reliable, and clean. That's our mission as the electric provider and the gas provider for a good part of Wisconsin. When we look at this question of clean energy, it is a complicated one. So today we've got power from nuclear, coal, gas, solar, wind, hydro, you name it. Batteries are coming in place as well. And we've laid out some of the most aggressive CO2 reduction targets in the country. So we already take pride in our CO2 reduction, which is over 50% since 2005. Our goal is now 80% reduction by 2030. It gets a little complicated, so we have to generate the power from somewhere, and we have to be able to prove that we can generate power when it's needed. We're part of a Midwest grid, okay? There's an operator. And our first role as a utility is to prove to this grid operator that we're reliable, that we can provide the energy our customers need when they need it. And we're measured on that. So we call that, those are the power plants that are there ready to dispatch at any given time. Okay. And then the next thing is what people think of when they think of electricity is the actual power that's consumed. So just because we have a plant doesn't mean it's always running. What's changing with this energy transition is that we've gone from a fleet full of plants, mostly coal plants, that we controlled when they ran, to new plants, solar, wind, that they kind of tell us when they want to run.
Yeah. So is this compatible as we plug in more things and we have more battery-powered everything? Is that compatible with also continuing to reduce the carbon footprint?
We think so. We just need the time. So we have an excellent plan. So we have a plan that takes us through these goals of 2030, which meets all these requirements to have the power plants ready, to have the energy ready to go, and to reduce CO2 by 80% by that time. What we need is time to execute the plan.
So, Dan, you mentioned that not every plant you may drive by is operating at any given moment. Like, how do we determine when a plant needs to be operating, when it needs to be shut down? Who makes that determination and how?
Oh, that's a great question. So we have a power operations group that works hand in hand with the grid operator. There's forecasts that are put together day ahead and hour ahead, and the grid operator sends signals to each of the utilities or the power plant owners of what they want from that plant and when.
So let's get into this. Brendan, you and I have talked about this before as well. Where We Energies has traditionally had coal-powered plants. In many cases, you've switched over to gas. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, as many folks listening right now are, the big coal pile in Port Washington that is now gone as that plant years ago was converted to natural gas. You're looking into doing the same thing in Oak Creek as well. Is that no longer a viable solution? I mean, what's wrong with doing that?
Well, coal, first of all, will be in our fleet through about 2030, maybe as long as 2032, but it is definitely going away. First of all, some EPA rules that are kind of forcing the hand of a lot of utilities, that either you have to put in really, really expensive changes to those coal plants that just doesn't make it economic viable. But also, we know that we can now, as we move away from coal, we can continue to provide what we call baseload or kind of power with solar, with wind. And then we're going to replace a lot of that with dispatchable, what Dan was talking about, that always on with our natural gas plants. And those can power up really quickly. Coal, it doesn't have that same flexibility, right? Coal takes a long time to turn on. It takes a long time to turn off. It's been the backbone of Wisconsin's power for generations. So it's served us well, but in the future, it's not needed, and there's ways to do it that's cleaner and more efficient.
And to that point, Brendan, we've obviously heard the news this week about a solar plant, a large solar plant that's being pursued at what's currently a landfill, if you're just southeast of Milwaukee Mitchell International. So what role do solar, and particular We Energy solar plants, now play in, as the grid expands and need expands? Can solar, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, obviously. What role does that play?
So solar and again wind are going to be there when it's sunny or when it's windy, and it's going to provide increasingly as we build these things out over the next 5-10 years. So certainly that's going to be what's going to be providing probably the majority of the power on those days when it's sunny and it's windy. But we know there's times that, we know certainly the sun goes down every day. It's not very windy. So how do we keep the power on? And that's where kind of the generation planning that Dan and his group do. And that's where we're talking about other things, whether it's batteries, whether it's natural gas plants or nuclear, which we still have in a part of our fleet, which, by the way, is carbon-free 24/7, right? So these things are all so incredibly important. Yes, we're building more solar. Yes, we're building more wind, but I'm sure Dan can touch on it. We also have new natural gas plants in our plans, just been in the news the last few weeks or so, that are also going to be increasingly important.
Yeah, Dan, I really wanted to ask you about nuclear. I think a lot of folks also listening might be surprised to learn we do still have a nuclear plant in Wisconsin, Point Beach. What is that? Manitowoc County, right? And that is cranking out. How many more years of useful life does that have? And could we see an expansion of nuclear? Nobody wants to build a new nuclear power plant, whether that's out of ignorance or whether that's out of legitimate concern. Regardless, nobody ever wants to do that. So what's the future of nuclear for We Energies?
Well, we're very pleased to have the offtake agreement with the Point Beach nuclear power plant. Point Beach provides about 20% of the energy for the We Energies and WPS utilities in Wisconsin. So it is a significant part of our energy supply. And as Brendan said, it's zero carbon. That plant is licensed for approximately 9 or 10 more years. That plant owner, Next Era, has to make a decision on whether they pursue a lifetime extension of that plant.
We're talking with We Energies today about the future of powering Wisconsin. If you guys can stick around for a break, a couple more things I want to touch on. Is there anything else that we haven't? Is there some new technology out there that perhaps we're looking into that we haven't addressed? And then also, what about cost? Are energy prices ultimately going up or down? We'll hit that coming up next on Wisconsin's Morning News. We investigate the future of electric power in Wisconsin. Dan, as We Energies continues to invest in renewable, we talked about that. We talked about wind and solar. Do you believe, at least for the foreseeable future, natural gas is still a part of the power generating capacity, at least here in Wisconsin, because of all the things that Brendan mentioned about the unreliability of some of those renewable sources? Absolutely.
So we do have a plan based on known technologies that we're comfortable with to get us to 80% CO2 reduction by 2030. And it's important for people to realize that the core of our generating capacity, or our fleet, has been coal plants for decades. The new core is going to be zero carbon generation. It's that combination of nuclear, solar, and wind. So when the zero carbon generation can't meet demand because of sun or wind that doesn't show up, that's when these quick start gas plants will kick in. And they'll fill those gaps. But when the zero carbon generation can come back online and fill it, they turn back off. So they play a key role as we go forward in this.
Sounds like a nice compromise.
It is.
Right? And it should be. But, there's this sort of war on natural gas. I mean, Chicago is investigating the possibility of not allowing any new natural gas ports to be installed in new construction. Mm-hmm. What's with the war on natural gas?
Yeah, it's an environmental, we think misguided. Matter of fact, that is our utility in Chicago, and our natural gas utility that is under attack, as you said. And there's been some common sense city council members who have pushed back and I think delayed that.
I hope so. I mean, don't come for my stove, man. I finally got a natural gas stove. I really like it.
Really expensive, by the way. I mean,
yes. How do I factor into this?
I wouldn't want to throw a lot of stats, but really expensive, right? Heating with electricity is 2 to 3 times more expensive than that furnace. And guess what? It gets cold in Wisconsin. It gets cold in Chicago. So I think that's the story we've been telling Chicago that people have been hearing and going, oh, we understand that a little bit better. Not to mention, by the way, about $75,000 to retrofit a house in Chicago to go from natural gas to electricity.
So what's new? Is there any new technology, Dan, on the horizon that we can point to? We got your wind, we got your solar, you've got some of the newer ways to adapt our traditional fossil fuels, but is there something new out there? I mean, besides nuclear fusion, which, as we've said, is a century off or so.
There's a lot of advancements occurring in the scale and efficiency of wind and solar, so we're very bullish on those technologies. Once we have those plants built and connected, we expect that over time we'll be able to repower them to produce more and more energy. There's a lot of discussion about...
So you get more out of what we've got.
That's our expectation.
We'll get more out of the windmills,
Yep.
We'll get more out of the solar generation.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
For sure. We expect that. There's a lot of discussion about batteries and solar, and we were talking on the break about EVs. Well, we're also installing lithium-ion batteries at some of our solar facilities to take advantage of periods when there's excess generation from the solar. So we charge the batteries, and guess what? At night, when the solar goes off but the load doesn't, we discharge the batteries. So it's sunshine after sunset. That's how we look at it.
You bring up the batteries in EV, and we've gotten a couple of people on the talk and text line asking. I am also curious. They run on batteries that you have to plug in and charge, and then you go off about your business. But as we've known for our entire lives, anything that's battery powered, whether it's your phone, whether it's a Game Boy, if you want to date yourself a little bit, those batteries die at some point, and you have to dispose of them properly. So as we slowly move towards, and we've mentioned 2035, a lot of places are targeting for mostly EV vehicles on highways. What happens to those batteries once they reach the end of their lifespan?
Well, we expect there to be significant recycling and refurbishment of the batteries. So, can't speak for the automakers, but the batteries we're looking at, we expect that they'll be pulled out, they'll be refurbished, they'll be returned. And I don't know how many lifetimes one of those cases will have, but we're also very bullish that there's going to be a lot of efficiency with the battery recycling.
Talking with Dan Kruger and Brendan Conway from We Energies this morning. All right, how much is all this going to cost? We have a lot of new infrastructure investments. We have things that we want in terms of a cleaner environment, but that is a substantial cost to retool some of these old plants and to add new things and technologies. So are we looking at, over the next 10 years, energy costs rising, or are there savings because of the renewable aspect?
Yeah, I mean, we're investing significant dollars in all of these things, right? And as part of that process, it goes through the regulatory process. And as those things are approved, and we expect, that they will be, after they're investigated, or at least most of them will be, they go into rates. So there is that. So certainly you start to see those projects, they are recovered in rates. However, the good news for our customers, and we've been telling this for a long time, is we expect significant savings over that horizon, right? Because as we bring on more sun and wind, guess what? It doesn't cost anything. There's no fuel costs there, right? Mother Nature provides all that. So we expect savings of about $2 billion over the next 20 years versus if we were just to continue to do what we are doing. And that includes if we had to meet those strict EPA guidelines, which would cost hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars more. So there's long-term cost savings. As those projects get put into rates, we'll start to recover those in rates, a small percentage per year. But the long-term cost savings are significant.
And it sounds kind of like a TIF district, like, well, okay, we're going to, for a while here, we won't charge these folks any taxes because they're putting up a building that ultimately then when we collect those property taxes, that will give a sort of a refund or a rebate to the taxpayer. But you have to be rate conscious.
Oh, we are, very much. Everything we do, we get back to affordable, reliable, and clean. So every project is evaluated using those criteria.
Dan Conway and Dan Kruger and Brendan Conway.
We've merged them.
Hey,
Or Dan.
Nuclear fusion.
There's some cost savings right there. Just make one job out of it here. Really appreciate you guys being here with us and setting the record straight on a lot of stuff. Learned a lot of new things today. So appreciate your time this morning.